In 1861, the United States fractured into civil war. But the young republic had come dangerously close to a similar breaking point decades earlier. In 1798, under President John Adams, the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts inflamed partisan tensions, prompting the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which nearly tore the new nation apart. Amid this crisis, George Washington turned to an unlikely ally. Patrick Henry, the fiery orator famous for his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, came out of retirement at Washington's urging. Once a fierce anti-federalist, Henry set aside ideological differences to defend the Constitution and protect the fragile Union. This final act created a framework for loyal opposition in a republic, demonstrating that passionate disagreement need not mean disunion. Hello, I'm Dr. Lynn Robbins, and welcome to Revolutions in Retrospect, where we explore the histories of the revolutions that remade the Atlantic world. Today, I'm joined by the James Madison Fellow at Montpelier, historian John Ragosta, author of the book For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. Thanks so much for being here with us today, John.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure.
So I'm really excited always to talk about Patrick Henry, one of my major interests for early on in my career. And I think that this final political battle that you write about is definitely the least well-known aspect of Patrick Henry's career. But before we get into that specifically, the time period of your book is right after the American Revolution. We create this new nation, and we almost have a civil war. Essentially, the nation almost falls apart before it even begins. And a lot of people don't know about this part of history. So, how close did we really come to a civil war, just a dissolution of the Union right after we founded it?
Lynn, it's a great question because here we are, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And we tend to think, well, of course, that all happened. And of course, the nation existed for 2.5 centuries. But when they started, and after the Constitution's adopted in 1788, they really didn't know how to run the country. And they didn't understand what was going to happen with political parties. They didn't think there would be political parties. And so in the 1790s, when you have this growth of political parties, what we know of today as the Jeffersonians versus the Hamiltonians, all because of a musical, that people are now sort of aware of that. That level of partisanship almost destroyed the country. There were headlines in newspapers across the country in 1799, 1798, Civil War. And they really thought the country might break up into regional confederacies, a Northeast, a Middle States, and a Southern Confederacy. So it wasn't inevitable. And we had to learn how to deal with partisanship. We had to learn, and of course, this is one of the key themes of the book, of what it means to be a loyal opposition. How do you oppose government policy when you disagree, but do so in a manner that is consistent with maintaining the continuance of the nation?
And I think that obviously Patrick Henry, as we'll get to, is a perfect example of that. And to start out a little bit with who he was, we know him, of course, as "Give me liberty, give me death" man. So if you could give us a little bit of context of that speech and where he was in his life. And when we think of that speech, we think of him as this firebrand of the revolution. Like, he's speaking out, and it's just everyone is shocked by what he's saying, and it sort of shakes everyone to their core. Is that an accurate representation?
Well, yes and no. It certainly shook people. I mean, it's this dramatic speech, but it's one of the most well-known speeches in American history. Give me liberty or give me death. It's also one of the most fundamentally misunderstood speeches in American history. So let's start with, you asked where was he in his life. I mean, it is interesting to note that less than a month before that speech, Patrick Henry's dear wife had died a very tragic death in his home. They had married. She was 16, he was 17. This was his childhood sweetheart. They had 6 children. He's going to have 11 children with his second wife. But so he's really dealing with enormous personal tragedy. And the speech occurs a month before Lexington and Concord. And so that's critical. This is before Lexington and Concord. But the speech is fundamentally misunderstood because today it's almost claimed as a radical libertarian. Give me my liberty. Give me what I want, what I get out of this. That was completely opposite of what Henry was doing. Virginia was trying to decide whether they were going to go to the aid of Massachusetts. And a lot of people in Virginia didn't know anyone from Massachusetts. And what they read about Massachusetts, those are those radical New England people. We don't really like them. And so the essence of the speech was we've got to stand together as Americans. And it's about community, not what do I get? Critical line from that speech. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Our brethren, those people from Massachusetts. So the speech is really about coming together as Americans to fight what were viewed as the British tyrants at the time. So it's not about me, it's about us. And I think if we misunderstand, that's obviously an important issue today, but we really misunderstand Henry, and we certainly misunderstand that speech if we don't understand it was about community. It was about joining together to fight the American Revolution.
That's a really great point. And like you said, it was before Lexington and Concord, but it was after the Tea Party. So that is the issue that creates sort of this upheaval in Massachusetts, correct?
Yes, exactly. So you have the Tea Party, and Britain responds with the Intolerable Acts, which are punishing Massachusetts. And Patrick Henry, again, a month before Lexington and Concord, he sees the revolution coming. The next gale that comes from the north will carry this, clash of resounding arms. I'm paraphrasing. I forget the exact quote, but he's saying, "The war's coming. The war's coming. We in Virginia must support our brethren," he uses that term, in Massachusetts. And the fact that it's before Lexington and Concord is really remarkable. He's saying we have to arm for what I know is going to be a war.
Right. And so the war comes. He is friends with George Washington at this point. He has an interesting relationship with Thomas Jefferson. But as we move forward, he is obviously on the side of the colonies during the American Revolution, but then we have this creation of a new nation, the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution. So what is going through Patrick Henry's mind as we are creating this concept of a new nation?
Well, and it's very interesting you mentioned Washington. So Patrick Henry does not attend the Constitutional Convention. Historians quibble about why he's not there. He could have gone. He was elected, but he says, I'm not going to go. But when the Constitution comes out, Henry is very concerned. He says, this government seems too powerful, too distant from the people. He's very concerned about the presidency being too powerful. He says the presidency squints to monarchy. This is great language that Henry uses. So he says, I can't support that. He said, I'm going to support the states. Henry is really the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement. I'm going to support the power of the states because I think the federal government is too powerful. And people say he has a falling out with Washington because Washington, being the president of the Constitutional Convention, is a big supporter of the new Constitution. And Henry and Washington disagree about that. But I think historians have overestimated Henry and Washington's disagreement. They understand they disagree about whether we should have the Constitution or we should have more powerful states. But they both continue to have enormous respect for each other. Henry was critical during the war as governor of Virginia to get resources to Valley Forge. He's the one who tells Washington about the Conway Cabal, which was trying to get Washington removed as the commander of the Continental Army. It's Patrick Henry who talks about that. And so they continue to have a good relationship, even though they disagree. So this is another example of what it means to be a loyal opposition. We can disagree politically, but we know that we both are really trying to do what we think is right for the country. But Henry does come out. He's the leading anti-federalist. He is by far the most important of the founders who stands in opposition to the Constitution.
Mhm. And I think one thing that a lot of people don't think about, which somewhat surprised me when I first started learning about Patrick Henry, was his issue with "we the people," because it sounds like it's a positive thing. It's "we the people." But what was his issue with that?
Well, Lynn, it's very observant because this goes to the really heart of the constitutional issue. Henry says, who said we the people? Who gave them the right to say we the people? It's we the states. Because the Articles of Confederation was a compact, basically a treaty. They understood it as a treaty of independent sovereign states. And if that's what you have, and that's what the Article of Confederation were, every state has the right to withdraw. Every state has the right to say, we're not going to go along with this because it's a treaty, just like the United States can withdraw from a treaty. And so Henry understood that when you change it to we the people, you've created an independent sovereign government that's separate from the states. And of course, that's exactly what Hamilton and Madison wanted. That's exactly what Washington wanted. They didn't want the states to be able to control the federal government because that's what had doomed the Articles of Confederation. So Henry understood exactly that the first three words, that means you've created a powerful, independent, sovereign nation that Virginia, the largest, the most populous of the states, can no longer control. And it's a perpetual union. We can't simply declare we're out. At the ratification debates in Virginia, your comment, by way of background, he launches into a speech about this at the ratification convention. Who gave them the right to say we the people? And it's because that he understood that was going to create a powerful, independent nation that the states could not control.
Right. And what were some of his other issues? I know essentially he was asking for something like what we now call the Bill of Rights.
Yes.
And his main opposition, Madison, was saying we can fix that later, whereas Henry's saying, why don't we just fix it before we pass it? So what was the big issue there with power and sort of what the Constitution was allowing?
Um, there are, I think, two groups of issues that are motivating the anti-federalists. The one that people are most familiar with is the one you're referring to, that we want express provision, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, search and seizure, due process. And so Henry's talking about that. George Mason, who's also an anti-federalist, is talking about that. The separate group was the power of this new federal government versus the power of the states. And what happens is the Federalists, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, they realize pretty quickly that that issue of a Bill of Rights is getting traction, and we don't really have a very good response to that. And so ultimately, what the Federalists do, and they don't like it, they don't want to amend the Constitution. They're afraid that if you open it up, who knows what's going to happen. But they ultimately say, well, okay, let's agree to amend the Constitution to put in some of those individual rights. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. But let's not do what Henry wants to do, which is eliminate the power of the federal government to have taxes. The government has no power if they can't tax and they can't generate their own income. Well, that was one of the things that Henry is trying to get done. So ultimately, the Federalists, and this starts in Massachusetts, but then it gets picked up in the other states, and ultimately even Madison has to agree, okay, we will amend the Constitution as soon as it gets adopted. Let's adopt the Constitution and then we'll amend it. So when they go to do the amendments, Henry and Virginia gives them a long list of amendments. Well, most of them are about limiting the power of the federal government. You have to go to the states for this. The states control this. The federal government cannot tax. We don't get those. We're not going to do that because that's what Madison and Hamilton and Washington were trying to prevent. And very intelligently, and today, in retrospect, very thankfully, we get the Bill of Rights and the protection of these individual rights. So, in many respects, though, this is critical for us to understand this back and forth, this tension. It's because of the anti-federalists that we get the Bill of Rights. I mean, if Patrick Henry and George Mason and these people had not spoken up, we wouldn't have gotten a Bill of Rights. And we have a very different nation, potentially, without a Bill of Rights. So, in some respect, one could say Patrick Henry is really the father of the Bill of Rights by demanding those kinds of protections. Now, he wanted more, but what he gets is the Bill of Rights.
Right, right. He wanted more, but he got something. And of course, the Bill of Rights are considered the first 10 amendments, correct? And then, of
Yes.
course, we have the right to continue to amend the Constitution as needed because of that initial act of the 10 Bill of Rights.
Right.
And
And as you had, I'm sorry, as you had indicated,
mhm.
Madison and the Federalists figure out they're in trouble about ratification. So very quickly they're saying, look, we can amend it. The Articles of Confederation, the only way to amend the Articles of Confederation was unanimity among the states. You couldn't get that.
No.
So the Constitution has a provision, Article 6, that allows you to amend it. And so the Federalists are saying, look, we'll amend it, we'll fix the problems. And as you suggested initially, Henry's saying, wait a minute, why are we supposed to vote in favor of this and then we'll fix it later?
Yeah.
Let's fix it now and then we'll vote for it. But what we get is no, let's ratify the Constitution and then we get the Bill of Rights.
Right. Which ended up being the better thing because now, as the world changes, the Constitution can adjust with the world that we live in. So we have, the Bill of Rights. Okay, now we have a new nation. George Washington is president, and Patrick Henry, who is beloved in Virginia, has done so much throughout the Revolution. We have a new government, and he doesn't agree with it. And I believe he's offered some pretty prestigious positions. And what is his reaction to this?
Yes, he's offered. I mean, it's rather astounding. We don't really remember Patrick Henry very well. People have heard of him, but if they remember anything, it's give me liberty or give me death,
Right.
which, as we've just mentioned, is misunderstood. He is offered Supreme Court justice. He's offered Secretary of State. He is offered senator. He's offered ambassador to France, ambassador to Spain, and he says, no, I'm not going to do it. I oppose this federal government. And then later he's getting older and he's trying to earn some money to help. He has 17 children who he's trying to set up. So he always declines these federal positions, which, would have been interesting. But implicit in your question, he does very early on, he says, I opposed this and I was afraid the government was going to be too powerful. But he says, it's not as bad as I feared. He thinks the Bill of Rights doesn't go far enough. He wanted more states' rights. He thinks the 10th Amendment is largely ineffective, and he was correct about that. History has shown it doesn't really do too much. But within several years, by 1791, 1792, 1793, he's saying, it's not as bad as I feared. He certainly thinks George Washington he has great respect for George Washington. He thinks George Washington is doing a very good job. He actually takes a little bit of a hit at Jefferson and Madison for criticizing Washington and says, these people aren't really treating Washington fairly. Washington won the revolution. He's sacrificed more than anyone. And, I don't agree with everything that Washington has done, but he's really leading the nation. So he decides, it's really working better than I had feared. And he's always pointed about, he says, I'm not abandoning my concerns. He always has the concern the federal government's going to be too powerful. But, we need to go along with the system as it is.
So this is the loyal opposition you're speaking about with he doesn't agree with it, but he's also not going to fight against this new nation that he believes was created fairly or as fairly as possible. But he just won't engage in it or take a part in it immediately because he doesn't agree with it, but he's also not going to try to overthrow it.
Exactly. And, a very good example, I'll give you a very specific example, which may lead us into some other interesting things. When Alexander Hamilton's financial plan comes out, of course, we're familiar that Jefferson and Hamilton are fighting. Hamilton's trying to create a more powerful government. Jefferson, who politically is very similar to Patrick Henry, they hate each other personally, but politically they're actually quite closely aligned. Jefferson is concerned about states' rights. He's concerned about the federal government being too powerful. Well, Hamilton creates that financial plan that's going to have taking on the state's debts. It's going to have the national bank, so on and so forth. Henry is still in the Virginia legislature when that comes up. And he believes it's unconstitutional. He believes the federal government, under Hamilton's guidance, with Washington's approval, is doing things it was not allowed to do. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you can have a national bank. So Henry leads an effort in Virginia to oppose Hamilton's financial plan as unconstitutional. And he gets the Virginia General Assembly to pass a resolution saying that what the federal government is doing is unconstitutional. And they request their representatives, the Virginia congressmen and senators, to try to repeal the Hamilton financial plan as being inappropriate. And so that's what Henry believes a loyal opposition does.
Right.
What's fascinating is compare that to what happens 7 years later when you have the Alien and Sedition Acts, and we can talk about that. Yeah. But Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, where Jefferson's talking about nullification. No, a state will just unilaterally say that the federal government is acting unconstitutionally, and we therefore are going to refuse to abide by federal law. Well, that's completely different. So Henry, I think, is modeling very on. He doesn't agree with the government. He doesn't agree with what Hamilton is doing. He thinks Washington was mistaken to side with Hamilton rather than Jefferson. But he says, no, the proper way to address this is for our congressmen from Virginia to stand up and try to get Congress to act, to withdraw this laws.
And I think that's what's so interesting is that during the Hamilton debate, Patrick Henry is politically siding with Jefferson, which means he's politically opposition of George Washington, which then, of course, later on seems to switch. But I think it might just be that we're not hard and fast on party lines just yet, or he's not hard and fast on party lines. So can you just, before we get to him sort of, if you will, switching for Washington, what were the party lines at this point, and a little bit about the ideology of each of them?
Oh, Lynn, I mean, it's such a great question because it's so difficult to answer. Washington is trying the hardest to stand above party, to not be on sides. And of course, Jefferson thinks, oh, he's in Hamilton's pocket. Hamilton thinks, oh, he's in Jefferson's pocket. And Washington Washington really is an amazing character. And we really do. There's a reason why he is considered the greatest president. As to what are the party lines, certainly the size and power of the federal government is the critical question. Keep in mind that Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention. Had Jefferson been at the Constitutional Convention, he probably would have argued for a weaker, smaller federal government. But he wasn't there. And, you know, he comes back. He was minister to France. He comes back and you've got the Constitution. And so he is, as the new Secretary of State, constantly trying to minimize the power and the extent of the exercise of power by the federal government to the advantage of the states. So he's very concerned about the Hamilton taking on the debt of the states, because he understands if you control the debt, you control the, this is exactly why Hamilton was doing it. If we control the debt, that means the business people have to be on the federal government side. The federal government controls finances within the states. He's very much opposed to the national bank. Where does it say in the Constitution you can create a national bank? He's also opposed to things like there's a tax on carriages. Jefferson doesn't talk a lot about the whiskey tax, these taxes that are reaching into the states and reaching people directly. And Hamilton is all in favor of those things. We want the people to be under the power and control of the federal government. But again, it's another great example that many people in the United States, the new United States, opposed the whiskey tax. Many people, obviously we had the Whiskey Rebellion, many people opposed the carriage tax because it was, you know, reaching into people's pockets and taking their money. Henry opposes the carriage tax, but never suggests that we can ignore it. Never suggests that we can simply ignore that federal law. It's federal law. The way to oppose it is to get Congress to change the law. So, the party lines are being drawn. Now, there's also a difference in urban-rural, which occurs very early on. Jeffersonians are clearly agrarian. They want to see an expansion out into Kentucky, into Ohio, into what becomes Indiana and Illinois, Tennessee. and prefer an agrarian system. The Hamiltonians prefer a merchant, more manufacturing base. Um, at this time, now, and what's curious is the impact of slavery is just beginning to have an influence. In the 1790s, Washington is a Federalist. Henry, as you point out, ends up supporting. I don't think he would ever admit that he was a Federalist, but he ends up supporting the Federalist policy. They're both, they own enslaved people. They own a lot of enslaved people. It's only later in the 1800s, after the 19th century, when we start to see the very strong division of slavery in the political parties. And the Southerners, the Jeffersonians, the Democrats become very much the party of the slaveocracy. But in the 1790s, that's still fluid, but we're beginning to see that influence because the agrarians, the plantation owners, are obviously slave owners. But as modern historians have pointed out, especially in the 1790s and into the 19th century, the merchants are also making an awful lot of money off of slavery. And so the very strong distinction between slave owners and non-slave owners, slave states and non-slave states, which we know is going to erupt in 1861, that's really developing in the 1790s, and it's not the controlling issue. The power of the government, power of the states, agrarian versus merchant and industrial class, those are the critical issues.
So what sort of brings this all to a head is the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are two very different acts. They're three acts, I think, but we kind of put them all together in this nice little phrase. So could you give us a brief overview on what those are, and then how these Kentucky and Virginia resolutions sort of threaten everything that we've, done in the Constitution, and even what goes against what Patrick Henry, much further than he thinks we should go.
Right. I mean, it was a recognition that we've gone too far. And ultimately, Jefferson, we'll come back to that. I think ultimately Jefferson and Madison also recognized we went too far with that partisanship. But the Alien and Sedition Act. So George Washington is inaugurated president in March 1789. The French Revolution breaks out in July 1789. And France and England are going to be at war almost constantly until the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And both France and England want the United States to support their side. Supplies, food, timbers, naval supplies, maybe even supporting them militarily. And so we're getting this real tension where they're both pulling at us. Washington realizes very early on, we can't get involved in these European wars. It'll tear the country apart. We're still new. We're a young, weak country. So he issues the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793. In 1795, he has the Jay Treaty. Terrible treaty. Everybody hates the Jay Treaty. It keeps the peace with Britain. We're not going to go to war with Britain, at least not till 1812. But it keeps the peace. The real concern in 1797, 1798 was possible war with France. It's called the quasi-war because France is demanding the United States, they after all supported us in the Revolution. And France is saying, you have to support us in our wars with Britain. Napoleon is rising in power. This is when Napoleon is starting in power. They say, you have to be on France's side. And we send peace negotiators to France, and France refuses to accept the peace negotiators. They won't even negotiate with the United States until we pay a bribe. And this becomes known as the XYZ affair. So, and again, it's hard for people to understand. We're really on the verge of war with France. People are worried about Napoleon invading the United States. And they adopt these Alien and Sedition Acts as possible war efforts, possible war laws. So the Alien Act gave the President of the United States to basically deport anyone who he thought was an enemy of the United States. It was easier if we were at war, but even at peace, the president could deport people. Interestingly, John Adams never uses those laws. They're on the books. He doesn't use them. More troubling, they passed the Sedition Act. And the idea was, if we're going to have a war with France, we've got to all be in this together. Americans have to unite behind the government. We all have to support President John Adams. And they literally make it illegal to criticize the President of the United States or the U.S. Congress. No, you just think about that for a moment. How do you have a country? How do you have a political campaign? How do you have elections if you can't criticize the president or the Congress of the United States?
And of course, the First Amendment was, just recently created.
Right.
Freedom
And,
of
and
speech.
and Jefferson and Madison are saying this is a clear violation of the First Amendment. You can't do this. Of course, interestingly, you could say whatever you want about the vice president, Thomas Jefferson. You know,
Insult him all you want.
yeah, that was my point. But it's literally illegal to insult the president.
Yeah.
And this was intended as a war law, but people realized very quickly this is deeply troubling. This is going to interfere with elections. It's going to interfere with freedom of press. And they start throwing people in jail. Again, historians told us for years there were 14 prosecutions, 11 convictions. More recent scholarship has shown that grossly underestimated the reach of these laws. There were over 60 indictments. They covered over 120 people.
Wow.
And they're throwing newspaper editors in jail.
Oh my gosh.
So opposition newspaper editors are at risk of going to jail for opposing the government. And at this time, every newspaper was understood. It's either a Federalist newspaper or a Democratic Republican newspaper. It's either Hamiltonian or it's Jeffersonian. They're throwing Jeffersonian newspaper editors in jail. So Jefferson and Madison have a huge problem. And it's worth pausing on this because they really saw a crisis. Their solution was terrible, but they saw a crisis. They said, this is a disaster. It's a violation of the First Amendment, and we're not going to be able to have a free and fair election if we can't criticize the government. So they're really, what do we do? What do we do?
Yeah.
And what Jefferson ultimately comes up with is the Kentucky resolutions. And the Kentucky resolutions, initially, Jefferson uses the term nullify. They take that word out, but they still say that an individual state may declare a federal law null, void, of no force and effect. Null, void, of no force and effect. So an individual state can basically say, we refuse to enforce these federal laws in our state, and we will not allow the federal government to enforce these laws in our state. And the risk, this is why the headlines I mentioned earlier, this is why people are saying civil war.
Yeah.
Virginia, actually, there was a bill introduced in the General Assembly at this time. It was never adopted, but it would have given a state court judge the authority to send an armed sheriff with a habeas corpus petition against a federal prisoner. Now stop for a minute and think about that. So a federal judge with a federal marshal has an indictment of somebody violating the Alien and Sedition Acts, throws them in jail under federal law. A state judge sends an armed sheriff to get them out of federal jail. Ooh. So this is why we're talking civil war.
Absolutely.
And Hamilton and others are really concerned that Virginia's going to arm and the federal government's going to have to march on Virginia. Hamilton at one point says, if necessary, the federal government will march on Virginia. There's a Virginia officer in the militia at one point says, keep in mind the problem is that France quasi-war. He says, if France invades, I will take my troops to the French banner rather than to the stars and stripes carried by a political opponent.
Wow.
Treason.
That is terrifying. Absolutely.
Treason. And so this was the level of partisanship. This goes back to your question about parties. So the partisanship had gotten out of control. We've forgotten that, no, we all agree with the Constitution. We're having a debate about whether that's valid, whether this is valid. Have you gone too far? But we all support the Constitution. We seem to have forgotten that.
Right.
And as I said, newspapers are talking about civil war. There's concern that people are arming. Virginia's talking about sending sheriffs to fight federal marshals. It was a huge problem.
So we're not really an established nation yet, and now we're hearing all of these things. It sounds absolutely terrifying to be a citizen living there, because are you going to be invaded by France? Are you going to be invaded by another state? You don't really know what's going to happen. And so George Washington steps in and he thinks of Patrick Henry. Now, Patrick Henry's retired, so he's off in Red Hill enjoying his, golden years. And then here comes George Washington. So what does he ask of Henry?
Well, that's what's fascinating. Washington's retired. Henry's retired. But Washington is still the greatest American. Everybody knows George Washington is George Washington. And seeing this going on, Washington's very concerned. And Washington's talking about the threat of the federal government marching on its own citizens and how we'll have disunion, it'll destroy the country. George Washington writes one person, only one person. He writes Patrick Henry and says, Patrick Henry, you need to come out of retirement. And Henry, keep in mind, he refused Supreme Court justice. He refused Secretary of State. He refused ambassador. He refused senator. Washington writes him and says, we need you now to come out of retirement to stop this craziness. And Henry had written Washington back when one of these job offers had come up. The last time he had written Washington, they had not communicated for years. The previous letter, Henry had said, I will only come out of retirement if necessary to save the nation from anarchy. Save the nation from anarchy. He gets this letter from George Washington, and he writes back and he says, I agree with everything you say. And Patrick Henry agrees to come out of retirement. And the crazy thing, you alluded to it earlier, Patrick Henry, he was the leading anti-federalist.
Exactly.
This was the guy who opposed the Constitution. He said the federal government's too powerful. He said the federal government will interfere with your rights. Just watch. I told you this would happen. He comes out of retirement. He makes that famous speech. This is the final political battle at Charlotte Courthouse, March 4th, 1799. And he basically tells the audience, thousands of people have gathered. Students from Hampton and Sydney College walk 20 miles to hear Patrick Henry, because everybody sort of knows this is Patrick Henry's final political campaign.
Right.
We know he's going to die in 3 months.
Uh-huh.
They seem to sense this. Henry, I warned you. I told you this was going to happen. Mm-hmm. But we the people agreed to this Constitution. As you said earlier, he didn't like the result, but he had no complaints about the process of ratification. He lost in a free and fair debate. And so he comes out of retirement and says, look, we agreed to this. We have to abide by this Constitution. The history's not perfectly clear as to whether he ever mentions Jefferson by name. Mm-hmm. But everyone knows who he's talking about. Everyone knows what he's talking about. This goes too far. These Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, this goes too far. You can't do this. You don't like what the federal government is doing. And Henry does say, go to the ballot box. You vote. You get new representatives. You send new senators to Congress. You send new congressmen. But you have to abide by the Constitution that we, the people, I didn't vote for it. I opposed it. Right. But we, the people, I tell people when I speak about this, I don't know about you, but the person I vote for doesn't always win the election.
True.
Henry's figured that out, that's one of the critical things in a democracy. You're going to lose sometime.
Right.
And when you lose, if you're not able to say, okay, I'm going to fight the next election, but until the next election, I'm going to abide by the Constitution. I'm going to abide by the laws. You can't have a country. And he says, if we can't do this, the only option is monarchy. Right. If we can't abide by the Constitution, so I think he's speaking very much to January 6th, 2021. He's speaking, look, you don't like the results of the election. You wait till the next election.
Right.
Wait till the next election.
So he's running for office, this speech. So what happens? Is he elected? And we know he doesn't live much longer.
Henry's always elected. He never loses. It's Patrick Henry. He was running for Virginia General Assembly. Washington asked him to run for Congress. And Henry, he's apparently feeling the illness, which, again, we know he's going to be dead in 3 months. Yeah. And he says, no, I'm old, I'm sick. I can't go the government's going to move to Washington, D.C., but I can't go. That's too far. I'll go to Richmond. Mm-hmm. And that's where the problem is. It's these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So I'll take care of it there. He wins his election, of course, but he dies. And he dies in June, and he was supposed to take office in November. What's interesting is if Patrick Henry had taken office, Thomas Jefferson is not going to be elected president. Almost certainly, if Patrick Henry, and it's all tied up into the Electoral College and winner take all versus district voting and so on and so forth, and we could get into it. But I'm not the first person to say this. John Randolph of Roanoke, who, of
Mm-hmm.
course, he's a little bit of a crazy, but he is a huge Jeffersonian. He's one of the leaders of the House of Representatives. He's actually elected in the same election. He's speaking at Charlotte Courthouse when Patrick Henry is making this final speech.
Mm-hmm.
John Randolph says if Patrick Henry had lived, Thomas Jefferson would never have been elected president. So it's, the crisis dissolves because Jefferson is elected president.
Right.
And but we don't know what would have happened if Jefferson had not been elected president. Might we have had that Civil War?
Right.
And
And
it's one
could
of
we
the,
have survived it? I mean, we survived the later one, but we had been in existence a lot longer.
that's right. And so would we have had, because there wouldn't have immediately been a Civil War, but would Jefferson and Madison have basically tried to withdraw the South and
Right.
split the country up into different parts? What's fascinating, and putting on a little bit of a Jefferson hat, is, and what I argue in my book, and I think people have missed this to some extent,
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson and Madison realized they went too far.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, several pieces of evidence for this. One is there's a letter that Madison writes Jefferson 8 days after the Virginia resolutions are adopted. Now, Madison drafted the Virginia resolutions. They're his. Every word is his word. And the Virginia resolutions are much weaker than the Kentucky resolutions that Jefferson drafts. Kentucky is talking about null, void, of no force and effect. Virginia says, well, the states should interpose between the federal government and the people. We don't even really know what that means. So Madison drafts Virginia resolutions much weaker. 8 days after they're adopted by the General Assembly, Madison writes Jefferson and says, I think we went too far.
Oh.
We will be accused of usurping power in the very act of complaining about the federal government usurping power with the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Ah, yes.
Madison, and suddenly Jefferson and Madison stopped talking about states' rights and state nullification. And instead, they're talking about the federal government's too powerful. If taxes are too high, they're going to get us involved in European wars. They're interfering with freedom of speech and freedom of the press. They're focusing on those issues that Americans agree about.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing that I think people have not fully appreciated, reread Jefferson's first inaugural address. People, the only thing anybody remembers that inaugural address is Jefferson's, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. And it's sort of treated as, oh, that was cute, that was clever, but it's sort of a throwaway. I don't think it was a throwaway at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jefferson very honestly and very personally, he says, we must unite. We Americans, we must unite in common efforts for the common good. What unites us is more important than what divides us. He actually says in that inaugural address, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, I understand why the Hamiltonians, I understand why the Federalists were concerned with France. Jefferson's a big supporter of France.
Yes.
For him to say, I understand the Federalists, I understand why they think things had gone too far. And so John Marshall, and we know John Marshall is no big Jefferson fan. They're going to fight for the next 20, 30 years. But John Marshall writes somebody the night of Jefferson's inaugural address. And he says, I read Jefferson's inaugural address because, of course, nobody could hear Jefferson speak it because he sort of mumbled and spoke, but he had it printed. And so he passed around copies of the address. John Marshall, of all people, writes one of his correspondents and says, Jefferson's inaugural address was great. Mm-hmm. He's trying to bring people together. So Jefferson, first of all, realized we've gone too far. The partisan battles almost destroyed the country. And Jefferson realizes what becomes one of the linchpins for the presidency, which is the president is the only elected official who speaks for the entire nation.
Mm-hmm.
And
right, it's not about a party, it's everyone.
Once you become president, and this is, again, until recently, this was considered foundational for the U.S. president.
Right.
The president's job is to try to speak for the whole nation.
Right.
And when you read Jefferson's first inaugural address, that's what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of this battle we've been talking about. It's because of the foreign policy battles, the battles between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, the battles over free speech, the threat of civil war, the partisanship that occurred, and Jefferson and Madison. And again, Madison oftentimes is saying, "Mr. Jefferson, maybe we went too far," and he does that a lot
Yeah,
over the course of their cooperation. But this is a really important one where he says, we've gone too far. It surprised me myself when I went back, as I was researching this, and I went back and reread Jefferson's first inaugural address.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, this is heartfelt plea that what unites us is more important than what divides us. The election's over. We all have to be on the same side and work together.
Isn't that interesting? It's sort of come from his starting to echo his good enemy, Patrick Henry, in that sense.
Absolutely. And again, we tend to think of these founding fathers almost like marble statues, or a
Right.
bust. Nothing. They had these personal animosities. Jefferson and Henry didn't get along. And I'm not the first to observe, politically, they're very similar.
Right.
And so for Jefferson to recognize, and he continues to be a states' rights advocate. I mean, he doesn't abandon his principles, but for him to understand, wait a minute, states' rights can go too far. This idea of nullification, this goes too far. Jefferson dies in 1826. Madison is still fighting the nullification crisis in 1828, 1830, when South Carolina and the battle over tariffs and Andrew Jackson, one of the primary lead-ups to the Civil War. Right. Madison continues to fight that and saying, no, that goes too far. So this is back to where we started. The country's new. It's still weak. It's a toddling nation. They're trying to figure out, how do you do this? And for Jefferson to realize when he's elected president and takes the inauguration in 1801, my fundamental job is to try to bring the nation together and to try to speak for the whole nation. And that's a huge development.
It's huge, and it's something that Patrick Henry was essentially practicing for many years beforehand. And so I have to ask, why don't we remember Patrick Henry like we remember because he never became president, because he didn't join the new government? Why don't we remember Patrick Henry?
Well, that's a great question. I think there's several reasons. I think you're on to one of them. The fact that he does not join the federal government, the fact that he opposes the Constitution. How can you oppose the Constitution? We love the Constitution. Had he been Supreme Court Justice, he may have been the equivalent of John Marshall. Had he become Secretary of State, that was a quick path to the presidency. I think the other reason goes back to the personal animosity. His political enemies, led by Thomas Jefferson, spend years and years and years trashing his memory. Henry dies in 1799. Jefferson dies 27 years later, 1826, excuse me. Jefferson continues to trash Patrick Henry's reputation until the day he dies.
Right.
I mean, he's talking to Daniel Webster in like 1823, saying, Patrick Henry was no good. He didn't read well. He didn't write well. Greedy. All he ever wanted was money. All he ever wanted was fame. And we could get into why, but Jefferson and Henry had personal conflict.
Right. He needed to just let it go.
He needed to let it go, and he couldn't. Well, he says, Jefferson writes James Monroe, and talking about what he viewed as Patrick Henry's insult. He talks about, it's a wound on my spirit which shall only be healed by the all-healing grave. I mean, even for Jefferson, this is over the top. So the all-healing grave. But it's true. It's, he's writing, James Monroe that in, I think, 1781. So it's almost 50 years later when he dies, and he will not let it go with Patrick Henry. Interesting juxtaposition. Jefferson and Hamilton disagree. We all think about Jefferson and Hamilton fighting. That was a political fight.
Right.
And Jefferson understood it was a political fight. He understood they disagreed, but he never attacked Hamilton in that way. The fight with Patrick Henry, that was personal. That was about honor. That was about 18th century gentlemen. And so I think those two things, between Patrick Henry not joining the federal government and then his reputation being sullied, Jefferson writes Madison, I think we need to pray devoutly for his death in 1786, I think, is when that letter comes, 1780s, all tongue with neither head nor heart. is how he refers to Patrick Henry. So, these
Don't get
founders,
on his bad side.
yeah, oh yeah, no, you don't want to insult Jefferson. Jefferson's really good. You don't want to be Jefferson's enemy. He's really good at taking people down. But it's very easy for us to forget they were people, and they
Right.
sometimes disliked each other. And so there's a real personal animosity between Jefferson and Henry. And I think that has a significant impact on Henry's memory, since he dies in 1799,
Right.
and Jefferson's going to be around trashing his memory for almost 30 years.
Yeah. And it's also a good note to listeners to be, you know, careful when reading, especially early biographies, really of anyone, because you're not going to get the footnotes. You're going to get the so and so said, the William Wirt biography, of course, just to look at who the sources are, and perhaps if it's someone who did not necessarily like the subject of that biography, maybe read it with a little, you know, just don't blindly believe all the words you read, certainly on early biographies.
It's a very good caution, and it's true even for modern biographies. It's, having written a biography of Patrick Henry, as a biographer, you have to be very cautious not to be captured by your subject,
Right.
because it's very easy to be captured by your subject.
You spend a lot of time with them.
You
So
spend a lot of time with them, and you're reading a lot of things from their perspective. But just generally, all of these founders. Now, again, Washington really stands apart. Washington is fairly extraordinary. But all of these founders were human. They had their faults. They had their likes and dislikes. And it's important for us to remember that.
absolutely. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful point. And we always ask people at the end, our wonderful guests, we ask them the same question, which is, how do you think this story sort of fits into the broader revolutions of the Atlantic world, whether it be, politically or, political fighting, or just how would you see this fitting into what's going on in the broader Atlantic world?
Oh my, it's a good question. Obviously, this is very much tied into the European wars and the
Mhm.
Napoleonic Wars, just as a historic, what's happening. The United States is struggling with how do we stay out of those European wars, and that fight about how do we deal with foreign policy. And it's interesting, Madison talks about that. Madison, back during the constitutional debates and very shortly thereafter, and this has a lot of relevance today, he says, foreign policy is going to interfere with domestic election. And so they realize that. I think the other aspect is American democracy develops earlier than what happens in France and England and ultimately Italy and Belgium and Germany and so on. The fact that we struggled, the fact that these transitions from, in many of the European cases, monarchy to a republic occurs over time. It's not simple. It doesn't just happen like that. It's not because people intellectually say, oh, we should have a democracy. Everybody should have a vote. There's battles and there's struggles. And it's even in the United States. We tend to think, gee, the United States is exceptional. We're the founding of modern democracies, founding of modern republics. And that's true to some extent, but it's always a struggle. It's always a fight. And you have to learn. We talked about loyal opposition. Everybody says, well, democracy is simple. The majority rules. Well, yeah. But second rule, the minority has to accept the first rule.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed to learn that in
Mm-hmm.
America.
Right.
So I just think the struggle, which occurs, of course, in England in the 1830s, 1840s, we start seeing liberalization in England. France, of course, goes through the republics and then back to the monarchy and then the various French republics until even after World War II. It's a struggle to run a democracy and republic. And if we forget that, we risk losing it.
Oh, well, that's just a perfect way to conclude this fantastic interview. And I have to say, what I love so much about your book is I feel like when we study the Revolutionary War, we tend to look at it as a preordained outcome. You don't feel that fear. You don't get that tension that we might not win because we're just conditioned as children. But what's so nice about your book is that it helps to show that this was not inevitable, that it could have fallen apart at any time. and because it could have fallen apart then, it doesn't mean it can't now. So it informs who we are as citizens today, how fragile our republic really is.
Absolutely, Lynn. I mean, it's as I was saying, it's a constant battle. It didn't just happen. They had to figure out how to run the country, how to run a democracy, and they understood it was going to be a constant battle because, back to what we were talking about, sometimes you lose, and you have to work for the next election.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being a guest today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to put a link to your book in our show notes. So, again, it's called For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. It's a fantastic book, great read. And hopefully, you'll go down to the show notes, do a click, and you can go ahead and purchase your copy. And thank you again for being here with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Revolutions in Retrospect. I'm Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, your host for this episode. Thanks to our producers, Dr. Jim Ambuske, Patrick Long, and Jeanette Patrick. Please share the show on social media and help other listeners find it by rating and reviewing it on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. Revolutions in Retrospect is a joint production between Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media.